Bill.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thanks. Good to see you, folks. I have to say this come to the odd time in my life. You know, I have a book coming out, and the publisher, for public relations reasons, has delayed the publication until April the 13th, 2023, because that's Jefferson's birthday. I just can't imagine, 1,000 people out there waiting. I'll go out and get my Jefferson's birthday book. But anyway, book publication is a very slow process. So up until Thursday, I was proofreading the final version of it. Then I had this huge index, and I was supposed to get the index back tomorrow morning. I actually finished it like 4:30 Friday, so I got the index shipped back. So then I say I turned my mind to this topic because I was consumed, I guess I would say. Now I'm going to talk about a Christian nationalism. Now we'll hope to make some distinction between nationalism and patriotism. In my own mind, patriotism means that you support your country for its highest ideals. And you are willing to criticize your country when it doesn't live up to those highest ideas. Nationalism seems to me to be kind of mindless support of your country, right or wrong, love it or leave it kind of thing. So I say that. So when people start talking a whole lot about nationalism, I begin to question, wonder about it. I want to also talk about this topic. I'm going to be ultimately talking mainly about the 18th century, when the sort of features of America were established. But I want to do some background stuff first. One is that we tend to look at the past through the perspective of today. And that way, in some sense, history is a conversation between the present and the past. But oftentimes we misunderstand the past because we assume that somehow it has a direct relationship to the present. It doesn't always have that. I mean, we live in sort of the post-World War II era. The percentage of church membership is double or triple in the 50s and 60s and 70s what it was in the 1800s, in the 18th century. So we are living, it's a very different age in the 1950s, 1960s, when our country is sort of infused with Christian nationalism. In part, that's because we find ourselves in the 1950s caught up in a Cold War with Russia. And the political rhetoric was that it was a war between sort of a Christian nation and godless atheistic communism. So that we tried to exaggerate the difference between our being a Christian nation and our mortal enemy being a godless nation. This also is a time, of course, after World War II, there is, for a variety of reasons, there's a huge upsurge in marriage. Marriages have been delayed for several years during the war. Soldiers who had spent 3 or 4 years in Guadalcanal or somewhere are glad to get home and start a family and take the kids to Sunday school and so forth. This is an age very soon, sort of the rise of sort of a second wave of very popular evangelism. Think of Billy Graham. And a whole lot of our popular culture changes in the 1950s in a way that has stuck with us. And we tend to think that those attitudes have always been in America. Really, in the 1750s and 1760s, less than 25% of the American population belonged to churches. So, it reaches 75% or so of the 50s and 60s. So it's a different world in 1750. We know from coins and so forth, we think that the American motto is "In God we trust." We see that phrase, "In God we trust," a lot. That's the official motto of the United States, established in 1956. In 1776, the American government put together a committee to establish the Great Seal of the United States. And the motto then was "E pluribus unum," out of many one. So "In God we trust" is an enactment in 1956. And you see it's in the context of we're fighting this mortal war with godless communism. We all know the Pledge of Allegiance. The first Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1882. Slightly different from the pledge now. They made another change in 1892, but these are really minor changes. I mean, once at first it says something like, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and the Republic," and then in 1892 they said, "I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the Republic," so they added two in there. But it basically, the little changes between 1882 and the early 1950s are sort of irrelevant. Then in 1954, Congress passes a law that adds the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. So now it says, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God." That's 1954, okay?
You know, there's no comma under, it's one nation under God, not
Yes.
one nation under God.
I know, you actually see it a variety of ways, but I think
Yeah,
officially,
and everybody pauses when they
Yeah.
say one nation under God.
yes, yes. Because that's how we
We're
would
trying
normally
to
say it.
correct that.
So these two, we think about a one nation under God. I remember when our first children were in school, they were learning the Pledge of Allegiance. And I think it was Matthew came home and said he could say the Pledge of Allegiance. We said, "Oh, let's hear it." And so he says he says, "Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please sit down." I always said that. We think of the nation, celebrating Christmas, and Christmas is certainly for us a religious holiday. Christmas did not become a national holiday until 1870. It's always kind of amazing to me. You read the family papers of people in, say, late 18th century, very early 19th century. They hardly ever really talk about Christmas. And you'll read the papers of founding fathers, for example, and they'll be doing business. They'll be writing business letters and so forth on December the 25th. There's no particular celebration. They don't have a Christmas tree. They're not exchanging gifts. I mean, really, the kind of Christmas we celebrate is an invention of the 19th century. It really comes out of primarily Victorian England. But I mean, it's not until Clement Moore, I think in the 1820s, writes the poem about the night before Christmas. And then Thomas Nast draws this picture of a big, fat, chubby, bearded St. Nicholas. But really, it's kind of the Victorian British version of Christmas. So the way we think of Christmas is like a national holiday, is an enactment of 1870. So we would think that these kind of ideas must have been there from the beginning. They were not. As I said in 1776, when the government, the national legislature, put together a committee, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, to design the Great Seal of the United States. And this would be a seal that would be used to emboss treaties and other kinds of documents and so forth. And on the front of that seal, there's an eagle, and in its beak, it's got this ribbon that says "E pluribus unum." out of any one. And then in one clause, it has eras for your defense and warfare and so forth. And then the other clause, it has the olive branch for mediation, peace, and so forth. And then you turn it over. And on the back of that seal, there's a pyramid. The top of the pyramid is pulled apart and it forms a little triangle. And this is on everybody's $1 bill. If you look on $1 bill, there is this odd thing. There's the incomplete pyramid. And in the top of that pyramid, there's a big eye. This eye is a common feature in many religions and cultures of antiquity. Sometimes it's called the eye of providence, but the sense that we're all sort of beneath the vision of some creator. And then above that little pyramid with the eye in it is a Latin phrase, which means he, or God, has favored our undertakings. This is finished in 1782. So there's this phrase, he, God, has favored our undertakings. Then underneath the pyramid, there are the words, a new order of the ages. And we tend to associate that with, the Bible or Christianity. Actually, those two quotes are taken from a Roman poet named Virgil, who died in 82 BC. So they're not that phrase, he has favored our undertakings. It's not from the Bible. It's from a pre-Christian Roman poet, because all the founding fathers were very, very deeply versed in the writings of the Greeks and Romans. So I just say that. I mean, you look at that emblem, it's not a Christian emblem. I mean, the pyramid and the great eye, looks like it's Turkish or something, with for the birth of Christ, Roman quotes. When Jefferson was tasked in 1776, not just Jefferson, but the Second Continental Congress, they are just getting ready to declare independence from Great Britain. And they were going to vote on it. They already decided to vote on it on July 4. But they had decided in July 2, they probably would be voting on it. And they realized that the American people, it needed to be explained to the American people and to the world, the justification for declaring independence. So they put together a committee of 5, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Jefferson, to write out a sort of a justification for declaring our freedom. I think you're all pretty familiar with the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson wrote it, and then it was sent around to the members of that committee to make some changes. They made very, very slight changes. We're not actually even sure what changes who made, but some very slight changes were made. And then a printer printed out really quickly a very fast version of it, and it was taken to the Second Continental Congress. And then for several days, the members of the Congress went over this declaration, the text, word for word. They shortened it by about 20%. Really angered Jefferson. Jefferson was a wordsmith. And, he thought, I always think of that line in Amadeus, there wasn't a single note that wasn't supposed to. That's how Jefferson, when Jefferson wrote something, it was in his mind finished. And it was basically finished. But the Congress, wants to make changes. So they cut out some things. They cut out, I think I mentioned once before, they cut out a long attack that Jefferson had on the slave trade, in which he implied, among other things, that slaves had rights, which most whites didn't like. And so they cut that long attack on slavery out. And they added 2 more references to Christianity. Let me.
John, we have a question.
Yeah.
The Virgil quotes, you mind repeating that for our folks at home? The Virgil.
What the quotes were?
Yes, please.
Well, the quote above the I is, I'm not going to try to read it in Latin, but the English translation is, he, meaning God, he or God, has favored our undertakings. And then underneath the pyramid are the words Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means a new order of the ages. And those, you know, we can admit, it sounds sort of biblical because they sound old timey, but they're not. They're now the Declaration of Independence, let me find it here, has only 4 references to God, and none of the references are to a sort of evangelical conception of God. I mean, most of these people, the famous founders are we would tend to think of them primarily as deists. Jefferson, as you know, I said once before, considered himself a kind of a Christian, but he didn't believe Jesus was divine. He didn't believe in the miracles. He didn't believe in the Trinity. So he was a very peculiar kind of Christian. Now, I want to read a little bit of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people. If this were my history class, I would say let's pause here and look at this. Necessary for one people. That's an incredibly important clause because these are 13 colonies. They've never been a nation. They're founded at different times for different reasons, have different economies, and they have not cohered as a nation yet. And in some sense, when Jefferson says it becomes necessary for one people, he in that phrase is almost creating the sense of unity of a nation. Anyway, it becomes necessary to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God. That's the first phrase. And that nature's God connotes more the theistic sense of a God who is like a clockwork who sort of set the whole thing underway at some prior time. And then it goes on down. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. So that phrase, the creator, is the second mention of religion. And then the rest of the Declaration has a sort of beginning, a sort of 2 or 3 philosophical paragraphs that sort of lay out the philosophical justification for evolution. Primarily when the king does things that are bad, then you have a right to create a new government. And then the great bulk of the Constitution, of the Declaration, is laying out one after another all the terrible things that the king and the parliament have done. And then at the very end, it comes back to a sort of more philosophical ending. It says, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. Again, that's that supreme judge of the world is sort of a deistic conception of the creator, the person who set underway the workings. And then the very final sentence, and for the support of this declaration with a firm alliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So you see, it's always the creator, divine providence. Paul?
Is it possible that he softened the language there because of the same tensions in the population that led to the First Amendment? Namely, there were 3 distinct religious groups that were Christian religious groups that were distinctly different, and you couldn't very well bring them all together.
Well, I mean, he's aware of that. And I think you're hitting at an important point that in some sense, religious freedom in America is predicated by the fact that there is a diversity of religions in the United States, unlike many other countries. And so it's in a way, freedom of religion is necessitated by the reality of religious diversity. Jefferson's aware of that, but Jefferson doesn't usually mince his words. And I think when he's saying this, that he's writing it more for the world than for the United States. And so I don't think it's, I think he's aware of that, but I think that's how he thinks of religion in his own life. it's God, it's creator, it's deist, it's providence. It's not a God, it's not a personal God who's doing miracles and raising people from dead and stopping, So that's, I think this is pure Jefferson. And actually, it's not just Jefferson. That's what Adams thought. That's what Franklin thought. That's what George Washington thought. I mean, George Washington, for example, is one of the least religious founders. I mean, there's no evidence that George Washington ever took communion. I mean, so he will accept religion in a sort of political sense, the way a lot of popular politicians today will always, sort of pretend to be religious when they're not, because they realize that gets them votes. But most of the key founding fathers, Hamilton, Adams, Madison, Washington, they are deists, not at all evangelical active Christians.
When the committee of the whole was hacking up that document, did they make any changes to those references?
No, they added the final two. Jefferson only had the first two. And so the number of references to God doubles as a result of what Congress says. But there's no attempt to sort of make it more orthodox or sort of make it more specifically Christian.
Yeah, I always assumed in the past that the environment there was that most states had a state religion and that they would have really done the same for the United States, except that for the plurality, and they couldn't get everyone to agree. But I had sort of assumed that, from the environment that they were thinking of governments, that a state religion would not have been out of what they would consider.
Well, that was the assumption worldwide. And I have to say that one of the revolutionary things of Jefferson's statute for religious freedom is he wants to totally separate religion from the state. And so the statute for religious freedom that's passed in 1786, and it's going to become the kind of background of the First Amendment. What's revolutionary about it is, again, that it sort of obliterates it. I mean, it's true that in England or France or someplace, if you were born in France, you remember the Catholic Church. And so you didn't really have a choice. It was just a part of your birthright. And Jefferson does not think that's true, nor do most of the founding fathers. So what I'm just trying to say here is if you look at the language and the rhetoric of the founding fathers, it's not explicitly religious at all. And when it is religious, it's non-specifically Christian. And it's not talking about the kind of evangelical religion that we think of. Now, another piece of evidence that the founding fathers did not see themselves as establishing a quote Christian nation is that at this time, certainly in the 1780s, actually into the 1800s, there are a series of squabbles, I guess you'd say, with the so-called Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were a series of Muslim nations, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and they lived in North Africa. And they sat there, and their economy is when shippers sailed in through the Straits of Gibraltar, they would attack them, either enslave their sailors. And there were many white American sailors who were enslaved by these pirates sent to work in North Africa and then take their goods. And the only people that they didn't bother were the French and the English because they were so powerful. But smaller nations, they raided on. And they demanded tribute. When Jefferson was ambassador to France and serving with John Adams, and then Adams goes to become the ambassador to England, Jefferson thought this was outrageous, that it was bribery, and that it was unbecoming to a nation to have to pay bribes. And he thought those bribes would continue to go up and up and up. Adams was more of a penny pincher, and he thought, well, that may be true, but it'd be really expensive to have a navy big enough to do anything, so it's cheaper just to pay the bribes. And so that was a real fundamental debate between Jefferson and Adams. But they both thought that this having to pay bribes or tribute to the Barbary pirates was not a matter of Muslim nations taking advantage of Christian nations. It was just a business deal. I mean, that was how they made a living. And they would have, and if it had been anybody, they would attack. And so one of the evidences of this is in 1797, we did finally work out a treaty called the Treaty of Tripoli to settle some of these disputes with the Barbary pirates. I'm going to read you a portion of this. This is 1797 Treaty of Tripoli. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character or enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between these two countries. So this is in the context of the Barbary pirates and the formal U.S. treaty that was approved unanimously by Congress was the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
What was the date of that, 79?
1797.
97.
1797. Now, I've got to jump to that's 1797. The Declaration, of course, is 1776. Then in 1787, the 13 colonies, well, Rhode Island doesn't, but the 12 of 13 colonies all send delegates to Philadelphia to try to come up with a constitution for a new nation. And they meet for 3 months in this incredible debate. Luckily for us, James Madison sat back at the little corner table like this. It was in a room no bigger than this where they all met. And it's actually 40 by 40 feet. And back over here was a little table. And Madison every day sat there working like a little dog, and he was little, taking notes in his own kind of shorthand of every word that was spoken. And then at night he would go home, and with his memory still fresh, he would sort of expand his text. So as a result of Madison's industry, we have just about a verbatim account of all the debates at the Constitutional Convention. And Madison's debates are a huge book. I mean, it's really big. And so we can get a sense of what they were saying. The word God or the Creator does not appear in the Constitution. Creator or providence appears 4 times in the Declaration. In the Constitution, it's not mentioned. That was purposeful. Now, some fundamentalists say, trying to prove that Christianity was at the heart of all this, they point out that during the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin made a motion that they hire a minister to come every day to open the session with a prayer. And so they say this shows, how Christianity was central to the Constitutional Convention. What they don't say is that no one seconded his motion. It was not voted on, so it just fell like a rock in the water. So you can say, if you're dishonest, that he did make that motion, and you can imply that suggests the religiosity of the meeting, but that's totally dishonest. Now, between the writing of the Declaration and the writing of the Constitution, there was a great intellectual battle in the new state of Virginia over the issue of religious freedom. And it has a lot to do with this diversity that you were talking about. I mean, if you think about the 13 colonies now become a nation, in New England, they're sort of a state religion. Their state religion that we would call originally Puritanism. At that time it was
Anglican.
Congregationalism. Yes. And then in Pennsylvania does not have a state religion, has a great plurality, including a lot of Quakers. Virginia has Anglicans, who are now Episcopalians. But also beginning in the 1760s, there's a fairly large movement of Baptists. And by 1775, Baptists probably outnumber Anglicans, Episcopalians in Virginia. Also in the early 70s, the Methodist movement begins, a kind of a break off from the Anglicanism. And there are a good many Quakers. And then down the valley of Virginia, there's begun in the 1740s, a migration of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. So Virginia's got Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, Anglicans, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians. And then that same diversity is true in North Carolina. South Carolina has, again, the Episcopal Church, the established church. So it's in that context that in Virginia, for example, it was against the law not to accept the Trinity. By law, your children had to be baptized in the Episcopal Church. By law, parents could take away the children from dissenters. And oftentimes in the parishes of Virginia, when dissenter Baptists were preaching, the sheriff of the Justice of the Peace, armed with support from the Anglican government, would come in, sometimes ride horseback into the Baptist churches and arrest the Baptist ministers and put them in jail. Madison was particularly appalled with this. Now, Jefferson was a quieter person, but Jefferson realized that for him, rationality of reason was really important. And anything you believe religiously had to sort of pass the bar of reason. And so Jefferson already by the time he was a teenager was doubting the idea of the Trinity, did not believe in miracles, did not believe in the resurrection, did not believe Jesus was divine. And he realized that if his personal beliefs became known, he would theoretically be subject to jailing. So when Jefferson begins to think about writing a law to establish religious freedom in Virginia, he had already been tasked in 1777, he and a committee of 3, to revise all the existing laws for colonial Virginia. Some of them were terribly out of date. Some of them were insufficiently precise. Some of them were not clearly written. So Jefferson wants to complete the revolution, not just by separating from Great Britain, but from remodeling all the laws of Virginia. And Virginia is the largest, most populous, most profitable state. And so he's aware that what happens in Virginia will have an oversized impact on the whole nation. So Jefferson begins to think about what is the relationship between a state and its people. And I went over this a lot a few weeks ago. Remember, Jefferson believes that there should be no barrier between an individual and his or her faith, that there should be no governor or no king or no minister. It's totally between a person's conscience and God. And that what a person believes should not be of any interest to the state. He wrote in 1784 a little book that's not published in 1787 called Notes on the State of Virginia. And he says, it does me no harm if my neighbor believes in no God or 20 gods. You know, this opinion is free. And so it upsets him that if his freedom is just based on the whim of the governor, I mean, in law, he could be put in jail. So Jefferson is going to write the text of the, I have a copy of it here somewhere. This is the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This is a really important document, not just in Virginia history or American history, but in the history of Christendom. I mean, it's in some sense, it's the first time since Constantine that there's been a sort of statement that the state and people's faith are not connected. So this is what Jefferson writes. Whereas Almighty God has created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or by burdens or by civil incapacitation, that is saying you can't vote if you can't hold office if you don't belong to a certain church, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. He doesn't say Jesus because it could be Muhammad had another author. And then he says it's to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. So there should not be a religious tax. You should not be forced to support a religion monetarily or going. It says our civil rights, our right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and so forth, have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. And therefore, that the prescribing any citizen as unworthy of the public confidence, by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument, unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. So he goes on and on, talked about this. And then he says, be enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled. When he says man here, he's not, now we're also gender concerned. But man at that time meant humankind. Although at this time only men could vote. But I mean, in other time when he says men, or like mankind, he's meaning not the male gender, but humanity. No man or no person shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matter of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. That is, he's disconnecting your religion or your absence of religion with your ability to be an active citizen. Now, you might think, is he only talking about, Baptist and Episcopalian and so forth? Later, Jefferson wrote in his autobiography, he wrote this in 1819, and he's reflecting back on things that he did, which what most autobiographies are about. And he says that he was talking about the bill for establishing religious freedom. He says, when the preamble declares that coercion is a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, an amendment was proposed by inserting the word Jesus Christ, so that it should read a departure from the plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion. He says this insertion was rejected by a great majority of the members of the General Assembly of Virginia, in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. As he's making specific, when he's talking about religious freedom, it's not the freedom to be Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, whatever, but it's the freedom to be any kind of religion. Now, I have to say that's a sense of religious freedom that stretches beyond what most Americans believe today. I mean, there are plenty of Americans, there are plenty of congressmen that believe you shouldn't be able to vote if you don't belong to a certain church or certain attitudes. And then Jefferson later, in a very famous letter to the Danville Baptists, the Baptists tended to be the strongest supporters of Jefferson because they were the ones most literally being persecuted in the colonies for their faith. And so when Jefferson was elected, the Baptists congratulated, were very proud of it. Some of the biggest Baptist leaders like John Leland were fervent Jefferson supporters. And so Jefferson, the Danbury Baptists, they're in Connecticut. They wrote a letter to Jefferson in October 1801, congratulating him upon his being elected. He writes back, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. He says, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act to the whole American people, which declared that their legislature would make, quote, no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Then he says, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. A lot of people think that phrase, a wall of separation, is in the Constitution. It's actually not. It's a letter Jefferson writes in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist of Connecticut, expressing his belief in religious freedom. And again, it's the idea that this is in no way a Christian nation. And what he's referring to here is the First Amendment. The First Amendment, there was a great debate when they were writing the Constitution about whether it should be ratified or not. And a lot of critics thought that there should be a Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. Madison did not think so, because he thought the Constitution gave the government only the rights that were specifically enumerated. So if it didn't enumerate, you could suppress, then you couldn't do it. But many people, including Jefferson, believed that all people deserve a specific, literal Bill of Rights that lays out the restraints on the government. And so Madison caves in to realize in order to get it passed, he's got to do that. But Madison is a right-hand man for John Adams, for Washington. So Madison is the leader of the Congress. So he picks out of about 200 amendments that were suggested. He picks out about 17 he thought were sensible. And then he submits 12 of them to Congress. And it finally goes through. So in 1791, what we call the first 10 amendments are passed. And we call them the Bill of Rights. This is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that again, that was to sever the relationship in every way between civil government, nation, and people's beliefs. Then it goes on, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of people to assemble, and so forth. So that's the First Amendment. I mean, it was the first thing people thought was most important to make sure that the Constitution defended, and that is the right of people to be free of any kind of interference with their religion. So if you think about all this stuff here are the founding fathers. When they believe in religion, most of them, it's a kind of a vague, sort of non-personal, we would say mostly deistic kind of creation kind of God. It's not a God that suits you as your personal savior. It's not a God that you pray to when you put a cake in the oven, that it rise correctly. It's not the kind of God that when you get ready to play a football game, you huddle to say a prayer, that God brings you victory. It's not that kind of God. It's a deistic, it's an overarching creator God who believes in justice. They want to separate the government from any specific religion. They make clear in that treaty of 1797 that in no way is this seen to be a Christian nation. And in none of their activities in the first 30 or 40 years does the government act in any way to sort of press or push or advocate any particular religious values anywhere in the world. And when they do later go to war against the Barbary pirates to stop their interfering with our commerce, you know, the marine hymn to the shores of Tripoli, that's where it comes from. But they don't say we're going to crush these Mohammedans and, you know, send evangelicals and Christianize North Africa. That's not their aim. And so the idea that they found this as an aggressive Christian nation that has a God-given mission to affect the world and to insert or establish their religion anywhere, it's just not in the founding fathers' ideas. They're not that kind of people. I'll talk next week about the Puritans. The Puritans had a slightly different version of religion. David?
Yeah. Do you have any sense of the international response to that, to those 18th century attitudes? The American, you got state religions in Europe and all that stuff. So what is their response to it?
I'd say the Enlightenment, of course, is underway by the 1750s. And these are explicitly enlightened attitudes. And the enlightened thinkers, for example, particularly in France, when the Bill for Religious Freedom is published in France, there's a huge outroar of enthusiasm by enlightened thinkers not by the Catholic Church, not by many of the aristocrats who benefit by it. But this was seen as the avant-garde. This is the new way of thinking. Now, again, nowhere in the Western world do established churches support it because it's against their interest. But this, in some sense, this was the emanation of a lot of thought in the 18th century by advanced thinkers, people like Priestley and so forth in England, Bolingbroke, and people in France. This represented the kind of cutting edge of enlightened attitudes that government and religion should be separate. And this becomes a very famous document. Jefferson's instantly aware of that. That's the reason he says very early in his life that three things he wants to be known for, in his life is, here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, founder of the University of Virginia, and author of the Declaration of Independence, freedom of religion, freedom from ignorance, and political freedom. So that's the key to Jefferson. And that's not just Jefferson. Adams taught the same thing. Washington taught the same thing. Paine, Franklin, this is the opinion. Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, James Wilson, Ben Franklin, this is their attitude. It's not the kind of, none of these people are wearing a cross on their lapel or an American flag. None of them, when they end a talk, do they say, God bless you, God bless the soldiers, and God bless the American people. They don't say that. That's a 1950-ish Billy Graham, US versus atheistic communism kind of thing. And it did not exist in the 19th century. So to argue that we were founded as a Christian nation and that our founders thought our goal was to spread our Christian way of religion around the world, it's just simply false. They did have a sense that our political ideals, based upon reason, that the Constitution, that the Declaration, they did think those political values were applicable and of use around the world. And they actually did believe that slowly thinkers around the world would read those documents. And there were efforts in England and in France and elsewhere to publish those. And thinkers around the world talked about the Declaration. I mean, there are books on the reaction around the world to the Declaration. So these were seen as great ideals. So in that sense, they thought that their ideas, that when this nation got into a crisis, rather than have a revolution, Jefferson would say they met like philosophers and would come up with a different plan of government. This was how they thought that by example, their values would spread throughout the world. Not because we would send soldiers, onward Christian soldiers to enforce these beliefs around the world. I mean, onward Christian soldiers have been anathema to any of these people. So let me just stop and just see if there's any discussion or debate or ideas. Mandy?
No, I just say that you can contrast this with the other old constitution. So the next oldest constitution is Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And Norway's constitution says Christian in the first article. And in the second article, it says the king has to be an evangelical Lutheran. So it was
revolutionary.
Revolutionary.
Yes. And people around the world, I mean, the thinkers of France and England, they read these documents. They were wowed, because this was an epochal moment in American history and in world history. I mean, it sounds, I don't know, patriotic just to say that, but it's just true, that it's one of the great moments in world history. And again, you get at this by just reading the private letters of these people. These people, they all write thousands of letters. Remember, there's no telephone, they all write letters. And they write official letters, and those are all kept, but they also write private letters. They write thousands of private letters, and you really get at their value of reading their private letters. These are not people who are like, hey, they're not praying, when they go out hunting, that they get successful. That kind of, it always kind of puzzled me, that I used to go to football games in my hometown, and before the game, the teams on both sides are praying, get on their knees praying, that God would bring victory. And what's God going to do, Am I going to support the Center Road Riders or the, St. Augustine, this is ridiculous nothing. Susan?
I'm reading a book right now that's giving me a lot of thought. It's written in the 1940s or 50s maybe, and it's a historical fiction, so there's a lot of fluff in it. But the history part is during the Revolution. The narrator has just come over from England. He's a scholar. He ends up in Williamsburg, Virginia. And so he was a Tory for quite a while. And it was all during, like in the book, you meet Jefferson and Washington and all these fun people and in their lives, but not like great leaders. They're just living their lives and doing whatever. But he eventually sees the freedom, the worthiness of fighting for freedom. But in the dialogues, I forgot that not everybody thought the same way that all the leaders did. That there were a lot of just normal people that weren't great leaders from England or any of that were like, so they too needed to read the Declaration kind of, okay, and it's much how I feel about what's going on politically now. I want to learn more because I didn't know all this. I just, so a lot of the skirmishes and battles or in Virginia and the Carolinas, I didn't realize how horrible it was.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's a miracle. I don't know what God people were believing in that we won because it was horrible. It was just and we meet a lot of French that are coming over, the Germans who decided to defect from the Hessians. And all. It's just a fascinating book of, I forgot what it was really like.
No, you're talking, there's a question about the complexity of an American scene in the time of the American Revolution and the complexity of values and so forth. And
it's true now.
It's true now. Yeah. And actually, I mean, the people were, this is one of those moments, another moment when the Constitution is being ratified. People slowly begin to realize that we're in the midst of an epochal change. I mean, remember, these are pre-Darwinian people. For these people, change is not normal. And we could grow up in the Darwinian world. We know that we expect change. Was it the only thing unchanging is change? But these people, change had been so gradual that a man who was 90 in 1790, his son grew crops exactly the same way he had grown crop before. Change was basically imperceptible. And so people began to realize we are in the midst of something totally unprecedented. And so there are a lot of people who originally had no political ambition get caught up into politics because it's the most exciting thing going on. And there are no polls taken. So we don't know what percentage of people supported the revolution, for example. Most people think probably about a third were relatively educated, read papers, and were active revolutionaries. Maybe a third were cautious and conservative and thought we had a lot to gain from staying in the British Empire and were Tories. About a third didn't know, didn't care, or living on the frontier, were uninvolved. But what happens is that you start seeing in the newspapers, people start publishing political, I guess just the editorials. Papers before that had been pretty dry and had offered things for sale and things like that, issued, government laws and so forth, but were not really opinion makers. Newspapers become opinion makers. People began publishing pamphlets. People began gathering in taverns to read a paper, tacked on the wall. And when Tom Paine's Common Sense comes out in January 1776, it sells 100,000 copies. It's an unbelievable blockbuster. And people get caught up, we're in the midst of, and so all of a sudden everybody's talking about ideas and principles and rights and so forth. And what power does the king have? What's the purpose of government? It's one of those moments in which it seems politics took over everybody's mind. It does it one more time in the summer of 1778, when the Constitution was written in 1787, but it hasn't yet been ratified by the states. So every state has to elect delegates and then meet state by state to have weeks and weeks of debates on whether to approve the Constitution. And all of a sudden, in every tavern, at every churchyard, every newspaper is filled with political debates. And it seems like the whole nation becomes sort of a political science seminar. Those are two critical moments in American history that sort of shape what turns out. And actually, I have to say, you read the op-eds in the newspapers, you read the pamphlets, you get a sense of the debates, and you're stunned by the sophistication of the people, by the interest they show, but how dedicated they are, but the quality of the debate. I mean, I just saw a little bit of the debate Friday night, and I can't watch it because I'm so upset by the lies and misrepresentations and so forth. But I mean, you read the debates of the founding fathers. When you read the debates of the people, these are really, people really know that there are really important things are underway here. And what we're doing here is this is sort of we're setting a precedent for world history. And it's awesome to read it. I'll just make an ad here. What my book is about, since it's coming out, it's a book. I don't like the title because the press chose the title, and it's aggravating. But anyway, so that the title they chose is 7 Virginians. Then the subtitle is The Men Who Made Our Republic. But I began to talk about Washington, and then George Mason and Patrick Henry, Jefferson, Madison, and Marshall, and Monroe. And these 7 people all lived together in a small portion of Virginia. They played a vastly disproportionate role in the Revolution, in the writing of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, the evolution of the presidency, the evolution of the Supreme Court. And they know each other, they write each other, and they write thousands of letters. And through these 7 people, you can sort of trace the political beginning of this nation. And so I read all their writings, all their letters. They're all printed, or they're available on microfilm, but they're all printed. And we're talking about hundreds of volumes of letters. And the debates at the Constitutional Convention and at the ratification conventions are all in existence. And you can read, you can see all the pamphlets that are published. They have reprinted all the pamphlets that were published during the ratification debates, advocating one way or other the Constitution. So if you're fanatical enough, you can sort of get inside these people. And you see what they believe and how they evolve. And I have to say, you finish all this and you're kind of awed. I mean, they're not perfect people. And they end up having blind spots that are shocking. For example, they even though most of them begin to see that slavery is wrong, they don't see how they can get out of it. They don't see an escape. But they all think slavery is dying because they think it's a dead institution. And so they think, why it's so controversial. If we pushed it, that we wouldn't be able to get the Constitution ratified. But it's a dying institution. So why risk the nation in defense of something that's dying anyway? Well, they're wrong because they don't realize in 1793, the cotton gin is going to be invented and it's going to revivify cotton. And so slavery is going to be a lot stronger in 1820 than it was in 1785. But they know they don't foresee the cotton gin. They also, for all their advanced views on everything about human rights and men's rights, they do not support women's rights. I mean, they can't imagine women being political citizens. And so we read these people, we say, how could they be? I mean, they're sexist and they're racist, but they are the most advanced people in the world. And their views on a whole range of the most progressive views in the world, but they're not 20th century people. And if you condemn them because they don't believe as we do, then you will condemn everybody who lived before about 1950. And so I think you just have to sort of think differently. But if you look at their views, look at their values, and that's where you kind of notice you read, for example, you read their family letters on Christmas, they're not all running out, getting ready for Christmas and buying Christmas presents and that kind of stuff. It's kind of shocking. People like Jefferson has really loves his grandchildren, and he's always buying them presents and shipping clippings and so forth. But Christmas Day comes and goes just like any other day. It's kind of shocking. Now you slip ahead to the 1840s, the 1870s, it's a different world. But time changes. Anyway, so I've gotten past this. But any other, I just want to make the point that the idea that this nation was founded as an aggressive, imperialistic Christian nation, explicitly Christian, it's just flat out wrong. And it's not because some modern liberal professor says it, it's that they read what they said at the time. And that's what they said at the time. So, okay, what time is it?
It's time.
Oh, it's time to stop. Okay. I hope that makes sense.
To be continued. See
Yes.
you all next week. Thank you,
What
John.
was the title of the book you wanted? What title did you want?
I had nation makers. See, I think these are the people who made the nation. And I thought, you see a title, 7 Virginians. I said, what does it mean? 7 Virginians who are blacksmiths? 7 Virginians who are cooks? That means nothing to me. But
You were right.
Yeah.
I'll tell you later, the real reason they didn't want that. Because they thought if you said nation makers, you might be excluding some people from being involved in the making of the nation. So 7 Virginians. Are they tennis players or are they all Americans? You have to read the book to find out.
Are they a basketball team? For next week, there's a question.
Okay.
Is there any chance to change the conversation of fundamentalism today? So anyway, that was from, I think, Federico or Donna. For next week, yeah.
I might be a little about that.
Think about, yeah,
Okay.
it's to change the conversation of fundamentalists today, so.
Congratulations
Okay.
on your son.
All right, thanks everyone at home.
Okay.
It's good to see everyone.
How many were online? How many were online?
Listen, we had a total of 48, we've got 23 home and 25 over here.
That's a good number.
Wow. Good job.
Yeah, well, Jeff, I need a day trip.